We're on to part 3 of the book this morning. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go to part 4. So part 1 was setting psychology free. We have to understand how the mind works before we can wrestle with the notion of revelation or biblical truth. And so the first section of the book was setting psychology free. And then the second section, which was the main focus of our retreat, was setting God free. So we had a prosecution and a defense, which we finished yesterday. And then having set God free, we're now free to set religion free, to set spirituality free from the the manacles of dogmatic religion. And so that's what I attempt to do in the third part of the book. It's called Setting Spirituality Free. The fourth part, which unfortunately we won't get to this retreat, was setting science free. So this morning I'm focused then on, now that we've understood who God is, and that the God we've been forced to worship very often was actually a projection of the human shadow, and that God is nothing like what we've made him out to be. Now that we've understood that God is this ineffable love, who's incapable of anything except love, now we can understand, we can release religion from the manacles of dogmatic, creedal formulations to soar into the mystical spaces affording us. So that's what we'll try to do in the last lecture. So the first World Parliament of Religions took place in Chicago in 1893, and it drew spiritual leaders from all over the world. It was basically the first time ever that the West had seen Hindu gurus, and interfaced with Buddhist teachers and Taoist teachers and Zoroastrian teachers. So it was an extraordinary learning opportunity for the world community, the world religious community. And there was a famous debate at that meeting between two theologians, one of whom claimed that in order to be a spiritual person, you needed to focus on one religion, one system, and dig down really, really, really deeply into it, way, way below the surface of just, ritual or creeds or whatever. The other person claimed, no, you got to spread your wings really, really widely. And he quoted an English proverb that says, "He knows not England who only England knows." In other words, if you've lived your entire life in England, you really don't understand what England is until you'll be able to compare it with other cultures, other parts of the world in which you've lived. Now you can understand England. And so my belief system is that both of them had a piece of the truth, that you have to, in some senses, make a home base in one place and dig really, really, really deeply into it, way below the kind of dogmatic, religious, ritualistic, even scriptural tradition, down into the mystical core of it. And that has to be your home base. But you've also got to spread widely, and you've got to investigate all of the other great spiritual systems of the world. And the image I use is that of a tree. When you look at most trees, there's like a mirror image of the tree above the ground and below the ground. That to the extent that the branches and the leaves are extending laterally and vertically above the ground, the root system is doing the same thing underground. So like the ground itself is almost like the surface of the ground is almost like a mirror around which the tree is growing, that it is growing upwards and outwards, above the ground in the same way it's growing downwards and outwards underground. And so the religious journey, the spiritual journey, is about, making a home base, but a home base which is informed by all of the other home bases that other spiritual seekers are working with. So we have to spread out really, really widely in our research and our study, and at the same time go vertically upwards and downwards into a particular home base spiritual system. Otherwise, we're just dilettantes floating about and examining a whole bunch of systems, but not going deeply in any one system. So that's what I'm focusing on today then when I talk about the journey from religion into spirituality. And so the first part of it then, if you look at your schedule, it's a fairly packed schedule this morning. The first thing I want to do is look at the evolution of the notion of God for Homo sapiens sapiens. And firstly, I want to say what God is not. I mean, yesterday we showed what God was not in the sense of God is not this, distant, demanding deity. God is not this pathogenic, homicidal maniac that, we've projected our own shadow material into God. So what else about God, do we need to get let go of? The first thing is we have to let go of the notion that God is a person. We have anthropomorphized God. And so, but God is not a person. God cannot be confined in that image. Now, part of the problem is that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that God is three persons, in one nature, that there's the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, right? One nature, a divine nature. The problem is that the word we're using for person in Latin is persona, and it comes from a Greek word prosopon, and prosopon literally meant the mask that an actor wore when he came on stage to indicate to the audience what kind of a role he's playing. And so if the mask looked like this, it was a comedy. If the mask looked like, it was a tragedy. And so the actor coming on stage wore a mask to indicate what kind of a character he was going to portray to the audience. Now, that word prosopon got translated into English as persona, and from that we get the word person and personality. So when we talk about the three persons in God, we got this image that God is literally three dudes, up there in heaven somewhere. And so the word person is a wrong word to use. God is not a person. Now, the issue is that you're a person and I'm a person. And therefore, the only relationship I can have with God is a personal relationship. But that does not mean that God is a person. I cannot anthropomorphize God. And I've used the example, I live in the middle of the forest. The forest is not a person, but the only relationship I have with the forest is a personal relationship because I am a person. So I'm not anthropomorphizing the forest, but I'm having a personal relationship with the forest. And similarly, we can only have a personal relationship with God, but we must resist the temptation of anthropomorphizing, making God a person. So God is not a person. We have to let go of that notion. Secondly, God is not a lawmaker, a lawgiver, or a law enforcer. We have this notion, God is up there dictating the do's and the don'ts. God is not a lawmaker. Now, there are cosmic principles, like the principle of karma, that what goes around comes around, or the law of cause and effect, or the law of love. I gave a whole retreat several years ago, on the different facets, different principles of the universe. But God is not a lawmaker, a lawgiver, or a law enforcer. He's not punishing people for breaking laws, in spite of what we read in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Scriptures. Thirdly, God is not partisan. There is no such thing as a chosen people, or a special religion, or even a chosen planet. And I've used this many, many times as well. The ridiculous notion that this one universe, which is, a single universe in a bubble bath of universes, that God has a predilection for this universe of ours. And that of the trillions of galaxies in this universe, that God has this particular love affair with the Milky Way. And that of the trillions of solar systems in the Milky Way galaxy, he has a particular love affair with our solar system. And that of the 9 planets in orbit around, our sun, he has a particular fascination with planet Earth. And that of all the peoples on planet Earth, he has a particular love affair with one particular race of people or one particular religion. It's a ludicrous notion. So the notion that God is partisan is a ridiculous notion. We have to leave go of that. And finally, the notion of God as a micromanager, that God is vitally involved in the details of every life, and he's making non-stop decisions about where to intervene and where not to intervene. So whose cancer is he going to cure, and whose cancer does he decide not to cure? When the 49ers are playing the Cowboys, which side is God on? Margie Galdes used to tell the story about Manny Manuel, that a neighbor of theirs, when the 49ers were playing a match, she'd have a candle on top of the television set, and holy water, and she'd sprinkle the television set with the holy water to make sure that God allowed the 49ers to win. So this notion that God is a micromanager, we have to dispense with that. So firstly, we have to clear the decks and make sure we understand what God is not before we begin to figure out, how we can wrestle with this ineffability. So that's the first point you want to make. As we evolve then as human beings, hominids have been on the planet for about 6 million years, but Homo sapiens only arrived about 200,000 years ago. But Homo sapiens didn't have language. And so there's an upgrade called Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens means the wise one. Homo sapiens sapiens means the very wise one. And the difference between Homo sapiens, which evolved 200,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens sapiens, which evolved just 70,000 years ago, is that Homo sapiens sapiens has language. And language is the ability to manipulate symbols intracranially in the head, and therefore give voice to verbalize what's happening up here in the head. That's the big difference. And once we learned how to manipulate symbols intracranially, we began to wrestle with the great existential issues. You know, who made us? What happens when we die? You know, who's up there, you know, orchestrating this entire show? And so at that stage, we began to wrestle with the notion of the gods. And as I said yesterday, we created 4 different kinds of language in order to engage with this existential question. And the first language is, these are Greek terms often, was cataphatic language. And cataphatic language is the language of theology and the theologians. You know, this notion somehow that theological treatises can tell us about God, you know, and tell us how God works, you know, and who God favors. Or this ridiculous notion that you find in the New Testament, and the Catholic Church has kind of chosen for itself, that Christ allegedly says to Peter, "Tu es Petrus, et super hanc Petram edificare ecclesiam meam." You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and whatever you decree on earth, I'll decree in heaven. So this notion that God is actually subservient to the Pope or to the Catholic Church or to any spiritual leader on earth, this is cataphatic language. It's ludicrous kind of language. The second kind of language is called apophatic language. And this is the language of the mystics. In the Hindu version of that is neti neti, not this, not that. It's the language that says X, God is not X. Y, God isn't Y. Z, God is not Z. There is nothing you can say about God that's accurate, that pins God down. So that's apophatic language. It's retreating from the verbalization of the experience of the mystery. The third kind of language is a kind of parabolic language, the language of parable, of myth and story and proverb. And I spent a lot of time talking about that yesterday. And it's the language that a teacher is forced to employ. Even a Jesus figure who's the ultimate mystic, you know, the ultimate avatar who realizes that he's a bite-sized piece of God. When Jesus is teaching the rest of us, you know, he's not going to use cataphatic language, and he can't retreat into apophatic language because he's a teacher, and therefore he must employ some kinds of words. So what kind of words does he use? Stories, parables, myth, and metaphors. That's what he is. So that's the third kind of language. A fourth kind of language then is kind of analytical language, the language of sociology or the historical narrative about the evolution of our thinking about God. So religious sociologists will employ a fourth kind of language. So we need to know, be kind of, realize at least, if not be conversant with these four languages. We have to become multilingual in a sense. And then we have to realize that in this trajectory, there have been we've created 3 different kinds of gods. And I'm talking about in the plural now because monotheism came very, very late to human thinking. And so there were 3 kinds of gods that you find when you kind of harvest the mythology and the religions of the world. And the first kinds of gods were tribal divinities, individual gods who took a particular liking to individual tribes and made covenants with them. And so the Jews believed, you know, that there was a God called Yahweh, and Yahweh made a particular covenant with this particular group of people. And so that this tribal divinity then followed them around. Wherever the Jews went, you know, Yahweh went with them. So it's a kind of a nomadic traveling God. And there were other tribes who had their own gods who traveled with them wherever they went. So the first category of gods is tribal divinities. The second category of gods were kind of geographically located. They didn't move from place to place. They were in charge of particular parts of real estate of planet Earth. And if you moved into their territory, you know, you had to be obedient to them. And the Roman Empire was really, really careful about not, you know, upsetting local divinities. When they conquered a new people, they insisted that the new conquered people continue to honor their own tribal divinities, because the Romans didn't want to upset those gods, you know, and have to deal with an upset divinity someplace else. Even though the Romans had their gods that they carried with them, They honored the local gods of any place that they conquered to make sure they didn't upset those and kind of have to deal with that kind of mishigas as well. So they'd be kind of geographically stable, settled gods. And then the third kinds of gods, I believe, were what I call portfolio gods. These were gods who didn't travel around with particular peoples or didn't have a particular kind of homeland, but they had specialities. Like if you were interested in art, here's the god you needed to follow. If you were interested in agriculture, that's the guy you needed to pay attention to. If you're interested in warfare, here's the guide you need to begin to follow. And so I call those then portfolio gods. So they have these three totally different categories of gods, that emerge in the human trajectory. Then there are kind of 5 eras as we're kind of continuing to wrestle with these gods. And the first era is where human beings are talking about the gods. And so this is the era of theology. They're kind of trying to figure out who these gods are. And it's all being done in cataphatic language. The language is trying to isolate God's behavior and God's motivation. So this is kind of an era in which we struggle with trying to understand who the gods were. We're talking and thinking about the gods. That's the first era. The second era is talking to the gods. Now we think we've understood who the gods are. We've made a covenant with a particular divinity, and now we're attempting to engage in a dialogue with this particular God. And that's the era of priesthood. That's when we begin developing rituals of various kinds and prayers of different kinds. Now we think we've understood this particular God. We know what makes him happy, like the smell of burning flesh, sacrificing an animal, that makes him really, really happy. And so now we engage in kind of slaughtering animals to make him appease him. And so this is the era of the priests, ritual and prayer. Then it's succeeded by the era of the prophets, where we're speaking on behalf of God. So some group of people or some individual purports to have a special connection with this God and is a conduit through which God speaks to the rest of us. God isn't just speaking to the unwashed masses anymore. God is speaking through a designated, prophet like a Moses figure, and now we got to listen to this character. So era 3 is the era of the prophets, and it's speaking on behalf of God. Era number 4 is the era of the mystics, and that is speaking not about the gods, not to the gods, and not on behalf of the gods, but speaking as God. It is the realization that every single one of us is a holographic fractal of source, and to the extent that we're aligned with that, then we speak as God, in a sense. I'm speaking as God in Sean form, you're speaking as God in Karen form, or you're speaking as God in Sharon form, or you're speaking as God in Teresa form. So every one of us, is a voice through which God continues to address the incarnation. And then the 5th era is the era of silence, absolute silence. There's no talking anymore. There's no need for conversation anymore, because the species has become aligned with its divine nature, and now no words are necessary at this stage. So that hopefully we're somewhere in between stage 3 and stage 4 on the planet right now. The question is, will we make it to stage 4, and then will we have the ability to continue until we make it to stage 5? That's the journey, and that's the mission for which we volunteered when we said, yes, Lord, send me. So maybe as a species, we're 60% of the way through, but we're facing very significant hurdles. Every hurdle is higher than the previous one that's been negotiated. And this is a very high hurdle. Can we make it from speaking, on behalf of the God, designated prophetic figures, to speaking as gods, that we all of us become mystics, and that finally we reach the silence of just unity consciousness. There's no need to talk to anybody about it, because everybody is having the experience of their own inner divinity. So that's the trajectory as far as the timeline is concerned. I want to talk then about kind of the history of religion itself. And in this section, I'm going to kind of talk about the difference between 2 main kinds of religions. And I'm going to talk about the difference between religion and spirituality. And then I'm going to give a theory of my own of spirituality and religion. So right now on planet Earth, sociologists of religion tell us there are 4,300 different religions on planet Earth right now. And sociologists of religions divide them into two categories, what they call ascending religions and what they call descending religions. So all of the religions of the planet can be kind of basically divided into these two categories. So let me talk firstly about ascending religions. The ascending religions tend to come from left brain activity. They tend to be based on reason, and therefore they tend to be more kind of masculine in their focus. They tend to be, there's two versions of that. There's the Western version and there's the Eastern version. The Western versions are monotheistic, and they believe in a kind of a one and done. You get one lifetime, you're born, you live a lifetime, you die, you get judged, and you go to heaven or you go to hell. So I call it a one and done. The Eastern version of it I call a repeat and rinse, reincarnational model. The objective is still, to leave the earth plane, but you get many incarnations in which to kind of get it right until you finally can ascend. Now, in this model of the ascending religions, there's an emphasis on the transcendence of God and the ineffability of God. And if you come from a Protestant Christian background, it is based on sola scriptura, only the scriptures, that the only valid authority is the scriptures themselves. If you come from the Catholic tradition, it is both scripture and it is the magisterium, that Christ gave Peter and the Catholic Church a special say about spirituality. So you have to listen to the Pope and the magisterium if you're a Catholic in order to kind of encounter this transcendence of God. And even in the East, in Buddhism, even if you're a bodhisattva and you work off all of your personal karma, there's still this notion about the objective of the exercise is ultimately to escape incarnation and to leave the earth plane completely. And very, very often in this model, sexuality is very suspect. Sexuality and nature are suspect in ascending models because they keep us down, that somehow the physical body, is a trap, and sexuality in particular is a trap, and nature is a trap. And so in the ascending models, there's not a whole lot of respect for nature. Now, the descending religions have a very different understanding. The descending religions tend to be much right brain activity, and therefore it's much feminine in its articulation. And it emphasizes not the transcendence of God, but the immanence of God. And so where Christianity talks about sola scriptura, only the scriptures, the descending religions will say sola natura, only nature. Nature is the ultimate. And in this model, sexuality is natural. Sexuality even is a spiritual system. And so you'll get tantric yoga teaching you how to use sexuality for spiritual purposes. And so in this model, then it's almost like pantheism, that God is simply the sum total of nature, that everything which is manifest, when you combine all of it, that is God. Now, pantheism is very different from panentheism. Panentheism is different. Pantheism is a belief system that the ultimate combination, all that is natural, gives you access to God. And in this model, heaven is a distraction. Thinking about the afterlife is a distraction. Thinking about the transcendence of God is a distraction. Now, obviously, both the ascending religions and the descending religions have their strengths and have their weaknesses. So I believe there have been a few systems that have managed to amalgamate the ascending and the descending into a kind of what I call the double-helix dance. When I look at the double helix of DNA, in some senses, that's what I see. This dance between nature and nurture, or this dance between the ascending and the descending. For me, that's really what spirituality is about. And a few different systems manage to get a handle on this temporarily sometimes. And the ones that come to mind for me are shamanism, early Judaism, and in particular, a form of shamanism called the Celtic Way. Now, the oldest religion on the planet actually is shamanism. You find it all over the planet. And there are three levels to the shamanistic model. There's the upper level, the middle level, and the lower level, or the upper worlds, the middle worlds, and the lower worlds. And illness is about the soul being misplaced between these three worlds, and the shaman is the person who's engaged in soul retrieval, can go visit the different levels and retrieve the soul. And very, very often, the shamans are using what they call plant medicine, like ayahuasca or peyote, in order to shift their states of consciousness and get access to those different levels, and therefore retrieve souls who are lost through illnesses, psychological or spiritual or physiological illnesses. Now, I want to just dig a little bit deeper into one of these shamanistic systems, which is Celtic spirituality. It's a shamanistic system, but it's a very evolved system in a sense. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just looking at what Celtic spirituality was about before it met Christianity. And I did another entire retreat on how Celtic spirituality interfaced with Christianity when they encountered each other. But firstly, I want to say that I believe, as a Celt myself, steeped in this tradition, that a Celtic religion managed to get this combination of ascending and descending religions really get it good. And so it's where the two forms meet. It's like the tree of life, digging deep and wide and ascending high and wide as well. And so within Celtic spirituality, you had the same three levels that you find in shamanism. You have the heavenly realm, which is inhabited by the gods and the goddesses. You have the earthly realm, which is inhabited by human beings, by flora and by fauna. And you have the underworld, which is inhabited by the ancestors and by the fairy folk. So those are the three levels within Celtic Christianity. And there's a kind of a communion of saints between all these three levels and all sentient beings. So Celtic spirituality then is dealing with, interfacing with, and dialoguing at all these three levels. Now, there are three forms of priesthood in the Celtic system. The first form is what's called the Ovate. And the Ovate are the keepers of the future. They're the prophetic figures in Celtic spirituality. And they are the ones who are constantly calling the culture back into alignment with nature. Now, in Judaism, that was the function of the prophet. The Jewish prophets were trying to continually call the Jewish nation back into the covenant with Yahweh. That was their function. It wasn't to predict the future. It was to call the people back into alignment with the agreement they made with their God. And that's the function of the Ovate in a Celtic spirituality. It is to constantly call culture back into alignment with nature, because the goddesses in Celtic mythology are the archetypes of nature, and the gods are the archetypes of culture. And there's a wedding, there's a constant dance that goes on between the gods and the goddesses, between nature and nurture. And the function of the prophet or the Ovate is to constantly look at the dance and make sure that there's no missteps, that both parties, are in alignment in the dance. So the Ovates then are the keepers of the wisdom of the future. Other words you might use for them would be the seers, the psychics, or the shamans. That was their function. The second level of priesthood were the bards, and the bards were the keepers of the past. These were the poets, the minstrels, the storytellers, and the performing artists. And for them, storytelling, also they were the great musicians, and they were the great storytellers. And storytelling was not then and is not now primarily about entertainment or even about information. The function of storytelling is not information, it is transformation. When you're listening to a great storyteller, the storyteller is going to allow you to take flight, to use the wings of your own imagination. And by imagination, again, I keep insisting, imagination is not fantasy. Imagination is the innate human ability, your inner divinity, that allows you to intentionally shift your state of consciousness, soar into different dimensions, interface with angelic beings or extraterrestrials or interdimensional entities, a dialogue with them, and bring back what you found and cross-fertilize it with your waking state of consciousness. So great storytellers, are not about information, they're about transformation. And that was the function, one of the functions of the bard. And the third form of priesthood were the druids. And the druids were the keepers of the present moment. They were the intellectual giants of the Celtic world. They were the scientists and the astronomers. They were the philosophers and the psychologists. They were the theologians and the priests. They were the healers. They were the lawyers, and they were the judges. So I had this extraordinary bunch of portfolios available to them. And the Celtic peoples lived in a state of liminality. Limina is a Latin word meaning a threshold. The Gaelic word for it would be a chailoit, a thin place. So liminality is where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, and we can move through it. So in Gaelic, we call it a chailoit, a narrow place. It's where the mystical and the mundane meet, where the sacred and the secular encounter each other. The entry points into other dimensions. And so some kind of thin places would be the imagination, just as I've described it. Music was a thin place. Storytelling was a thin place. There were actually people who represented mobile tabernacles of the mystical, who kind of radiated transcendence. Whom to encounter was to kind of be conferred with a numinosity, that their very being radiated that level of connection to source. And so then that's part of the Celtic understanding. And the single most important sacrament for the Celts was respect for nature. So, as I say, for the Celts, nature and nurture are partners, or nature and culture are partners, that the goddesses are the archetypes of nature and the gods are the archetypes of culture, and that they interface with each other. And so culture and nature for the Celts were passionate lovers and intimate dancers, unlike what happened in the West, where we're at odds with each other, and human beings are almost intent on destroying nature, or at best using it as a resource which they can deplete at will. So that's a kind of my understanding of the Celtic mythology. So I believed, and I had a vision some months ago about when I was reading this passage of Jacob's ladder, which you find in the book of Genesis, where allegedly Jacob was on his way back to the land of Israel, having lived in Mesopotamia for about 20 years. And he's on the way back, and he spends a night with a rock for a pillow, sleeping out of doors. And he has a vision in which he sees a ladder extending to the heavens, from earth to heavens, and there are angelic beings coming up and down the ladder. This is Jacob's ladder. And finally, he has a wrestling match with one of them all night long. And finally, he wants to ask the name, "What is your name?" And the angel says, "You cannot know my name, but I'm going to change your name. No longer will you be called Jacob or Yaakov. Your name now is Israel. Your name is the man who wrestled with God." And as I pointed out yesterday, this is not a kind of a jiu-jitsu or a kind of a pugilistic encounter or doing aikido with God. It is about wrestling with our mythologies and our theologies until we understand that we need to move from theology through priesthood and prophecy and mysticism into oneness, into the silence of union with source. So that's what Jacob's ladder means to me. That in some senses, it's this spiral, it's a double helix as well. And it's interesting to me that when I take the ascending religions, an upward pointing triangle, and I take the descending religions, downward pointing triangle, and I superimpose them on each other, I get the Star of David. When you impose them on, you have the Star of David. So that was like the Jewish version of trying to mesh the ascending religion with the descending religions. So I'm going to skip a little piece I intended to talk about because we're running out of time and we don't have time for questions. So let me get on to section number 3 here, moving from religion to spirituality. As I said in much more detail yesterday, mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. And if mythology and storytelling is the archived wisdom, proverbs are the kind of the essential distillation of that mythology. Proverbs are the one-liners, in place of a story, sometimes even an epic story that goes on for several nights in the telling. So proverbs are the kind of the radical distillation of the wisdom of a culture, and the mythology is the archived wisdom of the culture. So mythology, in some senses, for me, is what Carl Jung will call the collective unconscious, or what Hinduism will call the Akashic records. And I spoke to you yesterday about, a summer I spent collecting proverbs in Ireland and trying to understand, the importance of their proverbs. And so we are constantly telling stories. We are storytellers and we are story listeners. So we have to constantly measure our stories against our experiences. And we have to constantly realize that the stories we listen to And the stories we tell ourselves and tell each other, they have to be stories of transformation, not stories of information, and certainly not stories of disinformation or misinformation or propaganda. We're drowning in a sea, in an ocean of propaganda right now, from all sides of the equation. And the purpose of real storytelling and real prophecy and real proverb is to distill the essence of our own experiences and to figure out for ourselves, by creating a personal cosmology, what really rings true to my soul, what aligns me with God and with love. And they're the stories we need to be telling in the future. And so the journey then from religion to spirituality is a journey somehow of mining really, really deeply into the human psyche. When I've lived up here on the mountain since 1994. So I've been up here now 28 years, and I'm totally off the grid. I'm miles and miles away from PG&E. And so project by project, I had to create, solar power for myself, for my home. I had to create a septic system. I had to create a power system using propane gas that I take in, and I had to create a water system. And so I brought in, an engineer to try to figure out, where I might dig for a well. And the guy picked out a spot looking at the topography of the land, and he picked out a spot and he said, this is the best place to drill. So I brought in drillers, and $5,000 later, I had no water. So I brought the engineer back, and he had another look at the topography of the area, and he picked a second spot, and we brought the drillers back in, and another $5,000 later, I had no water. And then I was told by local people, there's a guy in town, he's a mechanic, a car mechanic. His name is Bootsy. I don't know what his real name is. They call Bootsy. And Bootsy is a water witch, a water diviner. Get Bootsy out, he'll find water for you. I bring Bootsy out, and Bootsy takes a twig in his hand, two parts of it, and he starts walking around. All of a sudden, the twig starts going, and Bootsy says, down there. And he says, I'm not really very good at this. So if this stick is going really up and down, there's a lot of water down there. I brought the drillers back in, and we dug down, and we found a water source that gave us 7 gallons a minute, courtesy to Bootsy. And Bootsy charged me $100. So I obviously gave him a little bonus for it. So Bootsy found me water, and the water's down 260 feet. So we sunk pipes down, and we got a submersible pump, with solar panels up top that pump water up to the highest part of my land. And I have got 2 5,000-gallon tanks to store the water, and then it gravity feeds over to my home. Now, the water, for that well is coming from the Sierras, the Sierra Nevadas. It's pristine water melt. But by the time it gets down to my place and up through my territory, the area is very geologically diffuse. So there are all kinds of minerals in the soil, some of them toxic. And so by the time it gets up, I can't drink the water. I have to go through a 3-stage purification process to take, to turn hard water into soft water, to take the heavy metals out of it, and then to use ultraviolet radiation in the water tanks to kill all the bacteria. And then, and only then, can I drink it. Now, for me, that represents the difference between religion and spirituality. Every religious system has been sourced by a mystical impulse, pure water from the Sierras. But every mystical system is coming through the geological strata of theology and scripture and dogma and creedal formulations, so that by the time it gets to the consumer, a lot of what you're drinking is actually poisonous. It's not bringing you nearer to God or allowing you to discover the God in other people. It's creating divisions and religious warfares, and separation from God even, and separation from nature, and separation from me. That's why in the Eucharistic prayer of the cosmos, we pray, the only sin is the sin of separation, that we believe we're separate from God, that we believe we're separate from each other, and that we believe we're separate from nature. Separation is created precisely because the water from source, the water of spirituality, is permeating through the stratification of religious dogma and fundamentalism and even scriptural traditions. So just as I mentioned that the human brain acts as a filter of consciousness, it's not the producer of consciousness. It turns the taps way down. So there's a little drip that's actually getting through. religion, in the same way, has, in my opinion, acted as a filter or a reducer for spirituality. So rather than allowing us to find God, it's disguising who God is. It's vilifying, and in some cases even demonizing who God is, which is why I had to put God on trial in order to discover that the God that was on trial, we had the wrong guy in the dock, that God never existed. So for me, religion is merely the training wheels for spirituality, that it is a necessary stage of the journey, and religion fulfills a function subsequently. And I mentioned that when I talk about the formation of communities. But it is the training wheels for spirituality. And once you have accessed a deep mystical spirituality, you don't necessarily need religion anymore, except perhaps for community. But certainly religious dogma and religious fundamentalism is not going to take you nearer God. It's going to poison your connection with God at that stage. Religion then is like it's like a little toddler. I'm thinking about Amy's little boy, Aidan, just 1 year of age. Aidan needs to be able to see his mother as his home base. So as Aidan begins to crawl around the house, he's going to use Amy as his home base. And as long as he can see Amy, he's prepared to investigate, the other rooms in the house. But if Amy were to be out of sight for a long period of time and Aidan couldn't see her when he turned around, he'd stop exploring his home. So he'd be so attached and so fearful of losing his mother, he'd stop exploring anymore. Now, it's important that we have a home base to come back to, but the home base itself must become mobile. Amy must be free to walk around her home, and Aidan is then free to explore even further, as long as he can see Amy every time he looks around. And so that's the relationship then between religion and spirituality. Religion is the mother, the temporary mother, whom we need to keep in our sights in order to have the courage to explore. But when we have explored, there's a level of independence at some stage. At some stage, Aidan is not going to need to be able to see Amy every time he looks around. He'll explore on his own. And we have to learn to explore on our own as well. And so monotheistic religions need to move beyond dogma and fundamentalism into mystical spirituality. And so I want to talk about then, what is the purpose then of a community itself? In answer to a question yesterday, what I said was that all human communities, all great inspirational human efforts inevitably get caught in the cycle I'm going to describe right now. Whether they're, political movements, whether they're, financial institutions, whether they're religious, whatever they are, every human endeavor inevitably falls into the following cycle. The first one is that there's an avatar, a charismatic figure that comes with a mystical insight into the situation that the community finds itself in. And this avatar articulates a vision that is really, really attractive to others. And it's the mystical impulse, now beating in the hearts of all of the hearers. And so the avatar will, a group of disciples will gather around this avatar. That's the next stage, the fourth stage. A group of disciples will find this teaching to be so fascinating, and the teacher so charismatic that they want to be associated with her. Inevitably, the teacher is going to die or often be assassinated or executed because they're a problem for the status quo. And now there's this little community bereft of its leader. And so in order to kind of ensure that they continue to exist, the community now organizes itself into some kind of an institution or an organization. And then religion is born. And at some stage, the religion is going to be taken over by some kind of an oligarchy, often self-appointed. And this oligarchy are going to kind of institute a theology and a creedal formulation that dictated to the members that say, if you want to be a member of our group, here is what you have to believe. Here's the creedal formulation. Here's the theology. If you can't subscribe to that, you're not one of us. So now we have orthodoxy as a prerequisite for being a member of our group. Now, if the group becomes powerful enough, it starts inquisition against members who do not believe. People who are kind of wandering into heterodoxy or even, heresy of some kinds, they're now dragged into courts and literally pulled asunder, arm from arm by inquisitors. If the group becomes really, really important and really, really powerful and has the resources, it will begin to visit its will on the outside world, those who are not members of the group. And now you've got crusades and conquistadores visiting their will on other peoples and other religions. And then so we've got full cycle now. A new prophet is born within that corrupted system. And the new prophet Peter said, guys, this is not how it was meant to be. This is not what the master said. You know, we've really, really strayed. We need to go back to and then point out what the real origins were. And I gave you an example yesterday of that happening in the Roman Catholic Church. St. Francis is born around the year 1200. Francis realizes what has happened to the Roman Catholic Church. It is at least orthogonally related, and maybe even 180 degrees related to the teachings of Jesus. And so he appeals to the Pope, and he sets up a whole new community of people who are to be prophets for the Catholic Church. And they're called the Franciscan Order in memory of St. Francis. And the Franciscans are the holders of this new mystical impulse for Roman Catholicism. And what happens? It goes through exactly the same cycle that I pointed out, with religion. And within 200 years, the Franciscans are the people who are leading the Inquisition in Europe. They're the ones literally hunting, the blasphemers and dragging them into courts, finding them guilty and pulling them asunder. So that's the cycle, unfortunately, of religion. So in order to create a vital community then, and which is what we tried to do in COJ in 1997, when we were founding it, I articulated three kind of principles that I followed when I was in Kenya and trying to create small Christian communities in Kenya. And it was three Kiswahili words, kujitegemea, kujitumikia, and kujieneza. Kujitegemea means that a community needs to be self-dependent or independent of other societies, so that we need, to be financially independent of others, not to be waiting for grants for somebody to allow us to succeed. So kujitegemea is about independence. Kujitumikia is about self-ministering, that whatever the needs of the community are, they have to be members of the community, who are capable of addressing those needs, whatever the need is, whether it's a lector, a communion minister, a priest, and so every member of COJ is a priest. Every member of COJ can be called upon to be a lector or a communion minister. And so kujitumikia was very important to us. And finally, kujieneza means self-propagating, but not in the sense of proselytizing others and trying to drag them into our group. It is trying to create a model which is, of interest to other little groups around the world who want to create their own version of what we're trying to do. Not necessarily imitating exactly what we have, but finding it inspirational in the sense, okay, that's a group in California that seems to be working pretty well. I wonder how we could do that in Tasmania right now. And so they were the three founding principles of COJ in 1997. And we talked about the notion of the talents that we come with. And so I believe that for incarnation, every individual is gifted with two kinds of gifts. The first kind of gifts are our talents, our abilities, whether athletic ability, mathematical ability, musical ability, public speaking ability, whatever it is. But these gifts do not belong to us. You're simply a mailman with a bag of letters. Those talents belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. You've come in service to others and you've been given this particular mail to deliver. So your talents do not belong to you. You can earn a salary as a mailman, but you can't make a killing. You can't hog the letters. You can't steal the checks in the envelopes that belong to other people if you're the mailman. You got to deliver them to the recipients. And the second kind of gifts are our problems. Every one of us comes into life with 2 or 3 major problems that we're going to encounter again and again and again. And it is our gift to ourselves, so that we're going to have to stretch during life. And so a community then is a group of people who are trying to do 2 things. They're trying to support each other in their search for truth, and they're challenging each other in their belief systems. And that's how we continue to grow. And then in that system, everybody is an ordained minister. That anybody every one of us said to God, "Here I am, Lord, send me." Just like Isaiah did, 2,740 years ago. "Here I am, Lord, send me." So in order to be, aligned with that ability within you, you have to become familiar with the thin places. You have to visit the Chayloitzana, in yourself and outside of yourself. You have to volunteer to be a veil piercer. You have to be able to help the community glimpse the mystical reality behind the illusion of the merely physical. And anybody willing to do that and to do that kind of work, ipso facto, is an ordained minister. And so, if there's a need in the community and there's a volunteer with the requisite gifts, and the community says, yes, we commission you to act in this capacity in our stead, that person is then ordained, is an ordained priest. And that is something that no hierarchy can do from you. You're not depending upon the Vatican to tell you can read, during Mass on a Sunday. You're not even dependent upon the Vatican to tell you as a woman that you're not allowed to celebrate Mass. As a woman in COJ, you're every bit entitled to take the host and the bread and say, this is my body, as any priest ordained by the Pope himself. And so finally, the mission then, I believe, is not about personal salvation, but about cosmic evolution. And I've shared this story many times of a Special Olympics that was held in Montreal sometime in the 70s. And it was a race of Down's syndrome young men and women. It was a 100-yard dash, and they're lined up at the starting line, and the starter fires off the gun, and all the kids start trundling up the tracks, and halfway up, one little kid falls down and cut his knee and starts crying. And all the other runners stop, and they look back, and they see the little fella sitting on the ground, his knee's bleeding, and they all turn and they walk back to him, and they pick him up, and they link arms, and they walk up the entire course, and they cross the finishing line as a unit. And the entire stadium gave them a standing ovation. We are not here to avoid hell and to merit heaven as individuals. We're not here so we can get to heaven and throw Coke bottles at the people in the pits. We're not here to be saved. We're here because there's only one of us. It's called God incarnate. And our mission and our purpose and our volunteering was to keep repeating until every sentient being awakens. And then we can cross the finishing line together. Thanks, Nancy. It's a great question. And so, my advice to people is, if you can't find a community, start a community. And I'm serious. Yeah. You're a very talented woman with a lot of personal journey and history, great history behind you. I've known you for 30 years at this stage, Nancy. And so, if you can't find a community, start a community. The ideal obviously is a community where that can interface physically with each other, hug each other. In the absence of that, you can start a Zoom community or join an existing Zoom community. You can find community in nature, as you say, by walking in nature. But there's something about transcendental meditation. Did a whole series of very interesting psychological studies many years ago under the aegis of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And he created a scientific formula that says if you can get the square root of 1% of the world population meeting together and meditating in a physical location, you could change the entire world. So when you're literally in the physical presence of other people, you're sending out brain waves that have a particular frequency. And when a few people are together, physically together, where 2 or 3 are physically gathered, their brain waves amplify each other. It's like if you're having a little child on a swing and they want you to push him higher and higher, and you're pushing it every time the swing comes back to you, you push a little bit harder. There's a trick to it. In order to amplify the swing, you need to make the timing of your intervention very, very accurately. If you push when it's coming towards you, you're going to break it. If you push too late, you're not going to help it. So you have to time it precisely when it comes right back to you. And then you start pushing, then you can keep amplifying, and finally the kid could do a loop-to-loop around it. So that's what happened with brain waves. When people are physically in the same space, their brain waves get into sync, and therefore the brain wave amplifies. Now, a wave has 2 main features. It has amplitude and has frequency. Amplitude has to do with the height of the wave, and frequency has to do the number of waves, per second. And so amplitude, that is how big a wave can you create. And when you get 2 or 3 people together, literally their brain waves are amplifying. And therefore you're going from beta, which is the normal waking state, into alpha and theta and even delta. And delta is deep, deep, deep meditation. So being physically in the presence of some people and meditating together is really important. Now, he claimed that if you could bring the square root of 1% of the world population into a physical location at the same time meditating, you could affect literally the entire globe. And they managed to do it twice, once in the Netherlands and once in the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi University that Robbie attended at some stage. And they brought about 8,000 people together. Now, at that stage, the world population was 6.4 billion people. The square root of 1% of 6.4 billion people is only 8,000. Wow. If you take the square root, you take 1% of 6.4 billion people, and you take the square root of that 1%, it is 8,000 people. And so there were 8,000 people in the same physical location for a week period. And then they monitored the international press that reported, episodes of violence all over the world, whether it was, assassination attempts or civil wars or whatever it is. And so on the basis of publicly generated and publicly available data, they showed that there was a 16% deterioration in world violence because of the meditation that was happening in the center in Iowa. Now, and so there's value to community. There's value to physical presence. There's a great value, obviously, to a Zoom community because you can interface with people all over the world. But there's a real value to being physically present with other human beings and amplifying the waves of the brain signature of compassion and love. If you can't find it, Nancy, create it. That's brilliant. Great observations, Trish. And I agree 100% with you that the developing embryo fetus, in utero is in constant contact with the other side. And for the first several years of childhood, they're in constant contact with the other side. The veil is very, very thin. And so these, imaginary friends that little children are having, they're imaginary in my sense of the word, not in the sense that the world uses it. Imaginary as it's made up. It's just, craziness, it's just little kids. What would you expect? They'll grow out of it. They're imaginary only in the sense that the veil is so thin that they're constantly, dancing in and out to the other side. They're interfacing with angelic beings. They're interfacing with extra-dimensional realities. They're interfacing with, dead loved ones or a part of their soul pod that hasn't incarnated yet for this particular incarnation. So they're in and out of those places all the time. Now, I believe somewhere around the ages 5 to 7 is different for different children. And there are some children who never lose it. Is Ursula here this morning? Jonathan, who's now 22 or 23, has never lost it. So there are some children who never lose it. But if you were to guess why it is that about age 5, kids tend to lose it, what would your guess be, Trish? You nailed it. You nailed it. Particularly the school system. We send kids to school around age 5. I know they're going to get indoctrinated. And so it's like the schooling system is not an educational model. It's a schooling system that regards kids as empty vessels to be filled up with data points. So you pour in geographical data and historical data and scientific data, and that's allegedly schooling. And so we kill kids' imagination. And if they start talking, out of turn about experiences they're having, everybody laughs at them because they know that's ridiculous kind of craziness. So we train it out of them through our school system and then through the mass media. And then if they're unlucky enough to have parents who don't realize what's happening, the parents will cooperate with this movement of substituting education with mere schooling of various kinds. Now, the word education is a very interesting word. The Latin is educatio, and e means out of, duca means to lead, and so education is leading out from inside of. That's education. Education is the kind of the Socratic model of asking questions and eliciting the inner wisdom of the child. Education is about eliciting that which is already present. So you're leading out from inside of by asking the right kinds of questions of children. But our model is we regard them as empty vessels who know nothing. They got to be filled up with raw data. No, so kids instinctively know, because I've differentiated many times between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is information that's generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain. Wisdom is information that's generated by the soul and processed by the heart. It's very different. So kids are filled with wisdom until we kind of empty the wisdom and replace it with knowledge. And we replace inner knowing with external data bytes. And at the other end of the equation, as you rightly point out, in the last few years of life, and particularly in the last stages of life, you have dying people encountering, oh, here's my mother, I can see my mother. So I always remember when my own mother died. She died on the 17th of November in 2010. And I spent the last 54 hours continually with her. I flew back from Palo Alto and was with her, slept in the room with her for the last 54 hours of her life. And she had a big extended family. She had 6 kids, she had 19 grandkids, and she had about 7 great-grandkids. And most of us were present when she died. We were sitting inside. We had moved her bed downstairs into the big sitting room, and we're all sitting around her and sitting on the bed with her. So there was like 13, 14 people present all the time with her. And she's lying down, and for a period of time, she got really, really agitated, and she wanted to sit up. So we propped up in the bed, and somebody sat behind her. And then I remember in the last 5 minutes of her life, all of a sudden, she looks up to the left-hand corner of the room, and her eyes became like saucers. And I knew she was seeing my sister Ethna, who had died of a brain aneurysm at age 43, in 1995. I knew that Ethna was there. And I knew that her mother there, I called her Nana, who raised me from age 6 until I left for the seminary at age 18. I knew that she was there. I have never seen bigger eyes in a human being in my life. And then she breathed her last, and we laid her down. And then I spent the next hour, I crawled into bed beside her, cuddled up to her, held her hand. And I spent the next hour traveling with her on the other side. So there's this extraordinary phenomenon that happens again and again and again, which is called terminal lucidity, where even people who spent the last 6 or 7 years of their lives in dementia, they haven't recognized their own kids. They can't have intelligent conversations. And somehow the day before they died, or the hours before they died, they sat up in bed and they recognized everybody, and they told everybody what they were witnessing at the other side, and then they died. So at both ends of incarnation, there are thin places. You're absolutely right. I thought that's a brilliant analysis. I've known from our correspondence that you're very, very conversant with the whole Celtic mythology and language and stuff like that. But that's an extraordinarily insightful analysis of our situation right now. And I would concur 100% with you. I think there's far too much of emphasis on the scientific aspect of Druidism, and that, the bardic energy of the storytelling has been diminished very, very significantly in the service of the fact that there are only 6 main streams of information. Now the mass media has been reduced to 6 streams, and the social system has been kind of telescoped and censored and deplatformed. And so very, very often there's only one storyline getting out. And even the modalities we're using, like for instance, television, rather than kind of the oral tradition, when you're watching television, it's like the television is doing most of the imagining for you. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing, what the creators of the movie want you to see, the special effects that they're creating. In the old days, as you're sitting with the storyteller, you got to do all that on your own. You got to kind of create the scenery and the location, and in some senses even the dialogue. And so in some sense, the storyteller is like the director of the orchestra waving a baton, and the members of the orchestra are creating their own music. And so when everything is provided for you, you lose the ability to provide for yourself. I find the very same thing, for instance, with a lot of modern people can't calculate anymore. You go into a shop now and you buy, a box of, package of potatoes for $3.70, and you give somebody a $5 bill, they can't calculate the change. They have to go to the cash register to do it. And so without calculators, we can't do math anymore. And without a spell check, we can't spell anymore. People used to be great letter writers. And so we've lost so many different faculties because of the advances of technology. And I'm not saying that technology is bad, but there's a downside always to it. So when we were listening to stories, we had to take flight in our own imaginations and create the scene, which has been kind of pointed to by the Shanachri, the storyteller right now. And so the storytelling has diminished significantly, which is the bardic stream. And as you point out then, the first one, the Ovet, the keeper of the future, those who would call us into alignment with source, those who would call us into alignment with nature, those who would call us into alignment with our purpose and our mission for incarnation, they have been diminished in number. And very, very often they're voiceless because, the bardic tradition has taken over the means of promoting the narrative. And so the prophets and the Ovets have to find different ways of connecting with each other, and by calling people back into this alignment with nature in particular and with the mission specifically. That's an extraordinary observation. Thanks for doing that, Amy. I think that's an extraordinary intervention, Joe. Brilliant observation, and I'm 100% in agreement with your analysis of it. I believe completely, that education has been kind of substituted with schooling, and they're very, very different. And that's not just happening, in the kind of the technical school system. It's happening in life itself. That how human beings are being schooled by the current memes, or the given narratives, is constantly separating us from our soul selves. And that those who appear to be disadvantaged because they're not as easily programmable or hackable or amenable to the given narrative, in some senses, they're saved the propaganda and they're saved the contamination, that the rest of us are unfortunately swimming and sometimes even drowning in. As well as that, I believe that I said to you a few days ago that I believe that because of the situation our world is in right now, that there's been a special class of soul coming into the planet since about 1999. And they were given various names, different waves of them. They were called the Indigo Children originally. Then later they were called the Crystal Children. But there were souls, I believe many of them, on planet Earth, just for the second or third or fourth time. They're not really used to planet Earth. And so when they arrive, they're absolutely traumatized by the amount of darkness, in our times. But they come in some ways then, and they're kind of disadvantaged in one sense that, physiologically or cognitively, they seem to be impaired. But what is happening is that it means the soul isn't being filtered as much, or the soul isn't being confined or limited as much by the brain, or by the kind of the physical spacesuit container. So these are very special souls and very special kids. And it's heartwarming to me to hear that in going back years, that you were privy to that example as a soccer coach, watching these Down syndrome's kids behave as souls on safari rather than egos on a journey to self, promotion, and that they could stop a soccer game because they weren't interested in who was going to win, as much as who was playing. Another incident comes to mind. This was a more recent Paralympics, only about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I think it may have been in Spain, but there was a little Irish Down syndrome kid. And if I remember correctly, he won 2 gold medals and he won 1 bronze medal. And he was best friends with a Spanish kid. And this Spanish kid had won 2 silver medals. And so they decided to trade off because the Irish kid had no silver, but he had 2 gold and 1 bronze. So he gave one of the golds to the Spanish kid, and the Spanish kid gave him one of the silver. So now the Irish kid had gold, silver, and bronze, really, really happy. And then the Spanish kid had gold and silver at this stage. And they're dead happy. Now, that's what sport, you've been a sportsman all your life. Yeah, that's what sport is supposed to be about. It's about, bringing out the best in the opposition and in yourself. And life is about bringing out the best in yourself and in others. So it reminds me of, I had a client one time who was a professional actor, and he specialized in improv theater, where he'd go on stage with another actor, and there's no script, there's no plot, and they would ask the audience to throw a word at them. Any word, didn't matter damn what the word was. And so somebody shouts up, banana. And now the two on stage have to make a drama about banana. So one guy is going to make a statement, the other guy is going to respond to it, and they're going to build a plot and a dialogue around banana. And he said to me, there are two rules to improv theater. The first rule is you can never reject the line your partner is offering you. You can't say, that's a dumb line, I can't work with that. Whatever your partner throws at you, you got to work with it. And the second one is your job is to make your partner look good, not to make you look good. And so you have to try to feed him lines that you know he can work well with. And his job is to feed you lines that he knows you can work well with. And that's the secret to life. The secret to life is you got to work with what life offers you. And secondly, you have to make others look good. And that's what the Down syndrome's kids are doing. Little boy falls down the soccer field, everybody gathers around him. Little boy falls down on the 100-meter dash, everybody goes back and picks him up. That's really life. We have to work with what we encounter, and we have to make the others look good. Thanks, Joe. Brilliant, Michael. Thanks a million. So that's such a multifaceted, question. The first kind of thing I hear you kind of hinting at, even though you didn't ask it formally, is did Christine volunteer to exit in this fashion? Some notion like that. So my belief system is that when we incarnate as a soul troop, we only know, as you say, we know three things. We know the track record of all of the souls with whom we're going to share an incarnation. Every single, we've seen how they've performed in past incarnations, and therefore we have a good idea of how they're liable to perform in a future incarnation, including our own. The second one is we know precisely the world circumstances into which we're parachuting. We know precisely the timing and the events that we're likely to encounter, in an incarnation. And the third thing is we know what our mission is, what we're going down there to do. Apart from those three things, everybody has free will. Every single player on the planet has free will. And so we're going to create a future based on the choices that all the players are making. And we're going to create, family environments, cultural environments, and human environments on the basis of all those choices we make. And therefore, since we have free will, we can't predict how anybody is going to actually behave. It's like my friends on stage doing improv theater. There's no script, there's no plot. You're going to have to work with what your partners are offering you. So that's one part of the equation. Maybe you hadn't specifically asked that part of it. So the question becomes now that your friend Christine has exited and Ken has exited under radically different circumstances. One, an old man full of his years, who was ready to go, and another woman who was violently killed. You've spoken to me about what the circumstances are, so I know the background to it. In that situation, was Christine, did she volunteer for this? Absolutely not. Was it a possibility? Obviously it was, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. So at some stage, the soul knew, that circumstances were likely or could theoretically arise in which there would be a very kind of a violent exit for this particular incarnation. Now, what kind of a preparation can a soul make for such an eventuality? And the personal lifestyle of the individual involved can be a huge preparation for that. So you take, for instance, how did Mahatma Gandhi exit? One of the great avatars of our times. He was shot to death by a Brahmin priest who was really upset with the fact that he was dismantling the caste system of India. So he was actually shot at a public meeting. Now, Gandhi, for years and years and years, had been practicing a Hindu mantra. Every single day, again and again and again, practicing this Hindu mantra. And as soon as he was shot, he began, this Hindu mantra. On Sunday last at Mass, Trish Hamilton had picked out this beautiful prayer for us, a Jewish prayer called the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And it is the prayer that Jews are meant to pray with their dying breath. When they're dying, that's the exit mantra for Judaism. So there's a preparation possible during life for even a violent exit. So Gandhi prepared all his life, for whatever exit would present itself. And it was a very violent, ending where he's shot in a public place, surrounded by an adoring population and killed by a Brahmin priest. Now, I have no idea what Christina's spirituality was like, or whether her lifestyle was a preparation for any manner of exit, but she exited in whatever manner she'd prepared for, her soul at least. Now, on the other side, we're constantly in the last moments of physical life. We are actually encountering the other side already. And when you read the near-death literature, the time dissolves, when we shed this mortal coil. And so very, very often, it seems the reports are from people who've been subject of really violent crimes, who've had near-death experiences, that they subsequently survived, that the soul actually jettisons out of the body instantaneously once the violence has begun. Almost like a pilot of a plane, who sees his plane is going to crash, and there's an ejector seat that he can eject from the plane, activate his parachute and float down safely to land while the plane crashes and goes up in flames. So for the onlookers and the people who witnessed, the sequelae of Christina's death, it looked like the plane went down in flames, but the pilot had ejected instantaneously. And the soul is not necessarily traumatized, by the manner of its exit at all. We encounter on the other side, that which we've left on this side. So I've said many times that people tend to die the way they live, and people tend to transition the way they die, and people tend to experience the other side the way they transition. So if this is a woman, filled with love and grace, whose life has been a life lived with compassion, and if she has some kind of a prayer, a kind of a practice or a mantra practice in which she's preparing all for her lifetime for her exit, that will, assist her enormously at the other side. Or if, she's jettisons out of her physical body, so she's not actually experiencing the violence of the action, and she's encountering other loved ones before her, it could be a seamless, transition. The people who find it really difficult on the other side, even if their death is not a violent death, are the people who've never practiced love during the incarnation, who've been filled with rage and greed. These are the people who encounter that level of anxiety and fear on the other side and are temporarily blocked from experiencing the light. Not that the light isn't available, but that they're not willing to look for the light. And so I have a practice as well as I go to sleep at night. Once I've prayed my mantra, I take a vow that I want to, in my astral body, I want to visit with enlightened masters and avatars who will teach me and heal me. And I volunteer to be available for discombobulated souls who are temporarily lost according to my ability level. I don't want to get stuck in stuff I can't handle. So I'm saying I'm surrounding myself with my own mentors and guides, and I'm willing to be available to discombobulated entities who are finding it hard to make the transition on the other side. But please don't get me into stuff I can't handle. So we can do that on a regular basis as well while we're still on this side. We call it in Catholic theology, we call it the communion of saints. In the Hindu model, it's a form of the Bodhisattva vow that we keep, helping other beings, at the other side of the veil. So there are many, many different possible scenarios, Michael, that Christine could be experiencing right now. And certainly the ritual that yourself and Cecile performed, and the love of others as part of that transition. And obviously in the case of Ken, the transition was a seamless one, in which there was a lot of preparation and a lot of welcoming parties at the other side. So the first thing, Patty, is, on behalf of the entire community here, to offer you our love and our support and our condolences, on the three losses, on Edward's loss, on the horse and the dog companion, and those devastating losses. And you're certainly you're suffering classical PTSD from particularly the final loss. So my heart goes out to you. And so, yes, there are both spiritual and psychological ways in which we can be of assistance to each other, in order to kind of resolve this issue. Now, so there's two parts to this, obviously. There's, the question of Edward, and his transition and what he's encountered on the other side. Like I said to Michael, it pertains to Edward as well. And so you can think about those aspects and how you can be of benefit to his soul. If it's wandering, it may not be, but if he is. So that's dealing with Edward's part of the equation. The other part of the equation then is that Patty's end of it. How does Patty deal with this devastating series of blows that makes incarnation itself, a trial and a persecution on a regular, maybe even a daily basis? I don't know. You and I haven't spoken personally about that, but certainly there are modalities out there, that can help you to kind of deal with the classical PTSD symptomology that you're encountering. Now, if you want to contact me privately, Patty, for a conversation, I'm more than happy to kind of talk you through some of that. You may need some, ongoing help, from a psychologist to help you. There are modalities. There are special kinds of psychotherapeutic techniques which are dealing specifically with PTSD, crisis management, that level of help. So finding a therapist in your area perhaps might help as well. And the third thing is, I don't know if there are other family members who are kind of dealing with the same level of trauma that you are, that some kind of family work together, if it's creating issues with the family system, or if other members of the family are having individual trauma or PTSD, looking for resources to help the family as a family, deal with this and help each other heal. But certainly on behalf of this community here today, I want to give you a huge, huge hug. I just want to put on record the privilege it is for me, to be part of such a group, and to be the recipient of so much, energy and love and organizational ability. I want to thank Bill Miller, one of the, I call the quiet man. We rarely see his face. We almost never hear his voice, but we're all the recipients of his ingenuity and his compassion and his love. And the second quiet man is David Cargeek. We rarely see David, or we rarely hear his voice. David and his extraordinary IT ability has been coming to Mass when I was still in Palo Alto every single Friday morning, every Saturday morning, and every Sunday morning, recording all of the homilies, and putting them up on the video on the YouTube channel with extraordinary dedication. Often having to edit, pieces that were indecipherable, in order to present a finished product that, was appealing to the eye and to the ear. And David has been part of this group. And when this series finishes, Karen and himself will do a lot more work that you and I won't even be aware of before you see the finished product. I want to say thank you to Lorraine Moore, who may or may not be on this morning. Lorraine was the person who created my website. And she did it as an act of love and service. I have never been charged for it. She's been doing this for many, many years. She puts all of the stuff up onto the website, Spirits in Spacesuits. I want to thank all of you for taking time out in your very busy lives in order to be part of our conversation, and for creating the extraordinary conversations we've had over the last 3 days. And just off the top of my head, there are 4 kind of conversations that stand out for me over these 3 days. The first one is Sharon Girod's great question about, if God has emotions, does God have negative emotions? That was one of the most interesting questions I've ever been asked, Sharon, and it really stretched me and allowed me to kind of think even outside my box, which has huge boundaries. Secondly, yesterday, Dee Harris's talking about, the price of coming awake. Dee, if you're here, that was an extraordinary intervention yesterday. And then Amy Dillon's response, about how to deal with burnout. That was a brilliant response from Amy. And today from Patty Hill, of sharing this extraordinary private tragedy with us and allowing us to be of support for her. And finally, this would never happen without this extraordinary angelic being called Karen Rubin. You have no idea how much love and energy Karen Rubin has put into COJ in the 15 years of her participation. Every kind of leadership position she's filled. A lot of stuff behind the scenes that nobody is aware of. The planning that went into this retreat and previous retreats, the contact she's made, all of these are, part of her genius. When I was writing this book, setting God free. I asked 4 people to read the original manuscript to give me feedback so I could brush up on it. And Karen was one of the people I trusted to do that. And moreover, I asked her if she'd be willing to create a piece of art that would go into the book. And the back page of the book, I wonder if you can see it. It's a mandala that Karen created specifically for this book. So I don't know how I can thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Sean. It is always my privilege to be a part of COJ and to know you and be able to listen to what you have to offer all of us. So for my thank yous, first to all of you for joining our retreat and enriching and deepening these days together with your time, your energy, your comments, and your questions, which were so incredibly deep, and your presence and energy. I'd like to thank Bill Miller for his unfailing assistance and support. When we're not online, he's around doing all kinds of things to make my life easier and make this whole system seem, at least on the surface, flawless. And then I want to thank David Karkik for his support throughout this retreat, for his recording and processing the videos, for his work in transcribing all the comments and questions, for his perfect eye in framing the recordings and his unwavering attention to every detail. And finally, as you've mentioned, Sean, his deep, deep commitment to COJ and offering access to all of your ideas and your work to COJ in Palo Alto and then beyond that. And finally, to you, Sean, golly, I want to thank you for your love, for your generosity, for your courage in writing this book, Setting God Free. We often talk about liberation. This is a critical step in liberating all of us from an all-pervasive, crippling, and erroneous vision of the God of the New Testament. And I also want to thank you for this integrated approach to the liberation of scripture, psychology, science, and spirituality as these things weave together for our sacred path home. Thank you.